Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism, and tonight is the second annual Professor William Prusoff Honorary Lecture. And last year, the professor that lectured for the Bill Prusoff Honorary Lecture was Alan Dershowitz, and this year it's Benny Morris. And Professor Prusoff, who's here with us, is a professor of pharmacology, and he was one of the first individuals who supported the whole idea, or the whole notion of creating the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism. And I was introduced to him by Dr. Alon Kanan, who's here as part of the medical school at Yale University. And I remember going with Alon to meet Professor Prusoff to discuss the idea of creating ISGAP, and then hopefully bringing ISGAP, or the Institute to the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, to Yale. And Bill was one of the first people to believe in the notion or the idea before it was really even created into something real. So we have a small plaque for Professor Prusoff in honor of today's lecture and his contribution to creating YIISA. Without his support, it would have been impossible to do. And Professor Prusoff, for those who don't know, has been at Yale University for more than 5 decades now, and he was one of the driving forces, of the founders of medical research that led to the creation of a substance, that I'm not speaking the words of a pharmacologist or a chemist, but created medication to help combat HIV and AIDS. And he was the first, him and his research partner were the first people to create medicine to combat AIDS. So his accomplishments in his field have been incredible, and his work has directly helped to save the lives and prolong the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And his work combating anti-Semitism, another type of disease, has also been helpful. So it's really an honor, and if you don't mind standing, and I'll bring you the plaque. So thank you very much. And also, on this occasion, I'm going to present the plaque on behalf of YIISA and everybody who's a part of the Yale Initiative's Interdisciplinary Study on Anti-Semitism, the researchers who are here, and our colleagues, to Benny Morris on this occasion. And there's, I'll introduce you in your lecture in a second, but all of the work that you've done in the pursuit of truth in a very complicated and complex part of the world, and with its history and its current situation, has obviously been impressive, and your current work over the years, especially combating radical forms of hatred and the demonization of groups of people. Your work has been very insightful and important, and there's nobody more appropriate than you to be here for this special evening. So thank you very much. Okay, so very briefly, so tonight's lecture by Benny Morris is entitled 1948 as Jihad. And as many of you know, Professor Benny Morris is a professor of history at Gurion University in Sheva. He's currently, he's published groundbreaking work on the study of the Palestinian refugee problem, and is one of the most important historians on the Arab-Israeli conflict, and has contributed much, sort of part of the breakthrough, if you will, on some of the understanding of the history of the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian and Israeli-Arab issues. He received a Bachelor of Arts in European History and European Philosophy, and he did a doctorate in Modern European Thought and History at Cambridge University. He's been a senior associate member of St. Anthony's College in Oxford, a McCarthy Fellow at the Brookings Institute, a Fellow at the Truman Institute at Hebrew University. He was a visiting professor at the University of Maryland, and he's been a foreign correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, and has written widely in academic publications, journals, as well as the media. He's the author of The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem from 1947 to 1949. He's the author of The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited, which was published in 2004. He wrote a book entitled 1948 and After, The Israelis and the Palestinians. And most recently with Yale University Press, he wrote a book called 1948, A History of the First Arab-Israeli War. And he has an upcoming book, again with Yale University Press. It's entitled One State, Two States, Resolving the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. And I must also say that I had the privilege of being with Professor Morris in Vienna and Berlin recently, where there was conferences dealing with the issues of Iran and its incitement to genocide and the potential of a nuclear energy program that the Iranian regime, the revolutionary regime, is pursuing, and the politics of hate of not only the Iranian regime but its non-state actors of Hamas and Hezbollah. And Professor Morris has been a leader in dealing with these issues and bringing about public awareness to them. And I just literally came back late from Israel, where I was a guest at the Iranian Center, the study of Iranians, the Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University, where I gave a lecture yesterday and was visiting with other scholars dealing with these issues. So the work of Professor Morris is timely and of extraordinary importance, so it's really an honor that you're here this evening. So, Professor Morris.
Well, I'm going to give a formal lecture. I want to be very accurate in what I'm talking about. And afterwards, I suppose there'll be time for questions and answers about historical subjects or political. In 1948 is Jihad. Midway in the first Israeli-Arab War, in August 48, Emil Ruri, a member of the Arab Higher Committee, the cabinet of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, blamed the Arab states for creating the Palestinian refugee problem. He argued that the Arab states had pushed and cajoled the Arabs of Palestine into launching hostilities against the Jewish community in Palestine, then known as the Yishuv, in defiance of the United Nations partition resolution, while the Palestinians were disorganized and unprepared for war, and they themselves, the Arab states, had launched their invasion of Israel in May 48, while disunited and insufficiently prepared. The war had resulted in the creation of the refugee problem. He rejected a solution of the problem by way of repatriation, arguing that the Jews would then hold them hostage, the refugees, and torture them severely. Ruri assumed that a refugee return would be achieved through negotiations with Israel, and an agreement so achieved would mark the beginning of Arab acquiescence in Israel's existence. We must inculcate in the heart of every Arab, he said, hatred for the Jews, and we must renew the jihad against Israel. The refugees, he concluded, would return to their places only after Palestine was reconquered. Months earlier, in January 48, just after the start of hostilities, Mati el-Muranam, head of the Arab Women's Organization, the female arm of the Arab Higher Committee, told an interviewer, the UN partition decision of 47 has united all Arabs as they have never been united before, not even against the Crusaders. A Jewish state has no chance to survive now that holy war has been declared. All the Jews will eventually be massacred. Mrs. Muranam, it should be noted, was a Lebanese Christian who had married a Palestinian Arab and moved to Jerusalem in the 1930s. Following the pan-Arab invasion of Palestine in May 48, the Saudi regime organized jihadi festivals around the kingdom, in the towns and oases, to mobilize volunteers for the war in Palestine. According to Madawi al-Rashid, an expert on Saudi Arabia, in 2 days, 2,000 men were registered, and it was said at the time that 200,000 were ready to perform jihad and sacrifice their lives. As it turned out, only several hundred were eventually dispatched to Palestine. The Saudi religious authorities, the ulama, played a major part in the mobilization for jihad. The call for jihad also vibrated throughout the Maghreb, and thousands of Moroccan, Algerian and Tunisian Muslims in the spring and summer of '48 set off to fight in the hills of Palestine, though only a few hundred actually reached the battlefields due to French, British and Egyptian interdiction along the way. Historians of '48 have tended to view the first Arab-Israeli war as a milestone and turning point in a national struggle between two peoples or ethnic groups, the Jewish Zionist and the Palestinian Arab collectives, over a piece of territory called the Land of Israel or Palestine. A cull through the available documentation, essentially through Israeli and Western records, points to an additional and perhaps important aspect, and for some of the Arab participants in the war, a dominant aspect, namely the religious face of the war. In light of the available records, it would appear that many of the Arab participants in the '48 war saw that onslaught against the Yishuv, or Israel, as a holy war, jihad against a foreign infidel invader. It is possible that the opening of the Arab state archives and a thorough troll through the press of the regions stretching from Yemen to Iraq to Tangiers will only reinforce the impression that the political and military leaders of the Arab states and the street in Cairo and Baghdad and Marrakesh and the soldiers who actually fought in the war saw it as a holy war, and not only, or perhaps even not mainly, as a nationalist war between two national movements. Several methodological problems arise here. The first and most obvious is that the archives of the Arab states, of the main Arab political parties, royal courts and armies are all closed. All the Arab states are dictatorships of one sort or another, and dictatorships do not open archives. This means that anyone interested in understanding the Arab side in the '48 war is forced in the main to view it through Western and Israeli documentation. The second problem is that of trying to work out what the bulk of the Arabs, the masses, civilians and soldiers actually thought in 1948. There were few, if any, opinion polls, and again we are talking about authoritarian states, not democracies, and states in which the vast majority of the populations were illiterate. For all intents and purposes, the masses do not speak in the documentation which exists. Occasionally a newspaper or leader will refer to what the street thinks, but that is all. We have no records, or almost no records, about what the masses thought or felt, certainly not from their own pens or mouths. The problem of lack of free expression also pertains to the more literate, numerically small middle and upper classes. We don't really know what they thought or felt. And when an Arab leader describes the ongoing war in '48 in terms of jihad, does that prove that we are dealing with a jihad or even a jihadist mindset? Is it possible that the term was used insincerely by this or that prime minister or king, attentive to the presumed will of the street, or to appease religious and political radicals? We do not have protocols of cabinet discussions, diaries of government ministers and kings, or the internal correspondence of the leaders. A third problem arises from the political culture, or the culture of discourse, that characterized and in some way still characterizes Arab governments and countries where there was and is no real separation between church and state. Often the rhetoric of politicians, the description or explanation of this or that policy or practice, will be couched in religious Islamic terminology. What we can say for now is that the historian must recognize that all his conclusions in this sphere must remain tentative until the Arab archives are opened, and it is possible, if that apocalyptic event ever takes place, that we will still remain largely in the dark about the question I am dealing with, partly because the question itself is one of mindset rather than concrete fact. And we are speaking of the mindsets of many millions of people rather than those of a coterie of politicians. All I can say for the present is that the historians and students of the Arab world in '48 should treat seriously what the available records are telling us about what certain people in the Arab world thought and said, and not abruptly dismiss their utterances just because they do not match the contemporary historians' or students' historical and political views, preferences and prejudices. And when 1948's Arab leaders, religious, military and political, tell us something, we should pay attention to what they are saying. Perhaps they are giving voice to a major truth. The history of the Islamic world is studied by holy wars against infidel peoples and polities. The rise of Islam was characterized by an enormous, aggressive jihadi wave in the 7th and early 8th centuries, which saw the Arab conquerors sweep over the Middle East and North Africa as far as Spain and southern France. A second eruption of jihad, defensive in nature, occurred in the Middle Ages when the Muslim warriors contained and then drove back the Crusaders and destroyed their kingdoms in the Levant. A third aggressive wave of jihad occurred in the early modern period when Turkic armies from the middle of the 15th century until the end of the 17th century assaulted the Balkans and Central Europe, reaching the gates of Budapest and Vienna. Today we are in the throes of the fourth wave of jihad, and there is a dispute in the West about whether to attribute it to Islam as a whole or just to radical Islamists. A wave directed against the West and its promontories around the world, stretching from the Philippines and Mumbai through East and West Africa, London, Madrid and the Twin Towers in New York. At the center of this wave are the wars against infidels in Afghanistan, Iraq and Palestine. One can view the current jihadi wave as aggressive or defensive. There are strong arguments for both positions. Be that as it may, it is possible that in several hundred years' time, the war between Arabs and Jews in 1948 will be seen as the beginning of, or at least a major milestone in, this wave that confronts the West in our time. In the days after the UN General Assembly passed the partition resolution, waves of rioters hit the streets of the large Arab towns in the Arab world and attacked Jews and Europeans and their property. At the beginning of December 47, there were pogroms in Aden, Bahrain and Aleppo in Syria, and a variety of assaults on Jews in Cairo and Damascus. The rioters commonly shouted, "Idbach al-Yahud," kill the Jews, and in most cases the authorities failed to rein them in, certainly not expeditiously. Dozens of Jews were murdered and hundreds of houses were torched. On the 2nd of December 47, 3 days after the UN vote, the ulama, the chief scholars of theology of the University of Al-Azhar in Cairo, perhaps the most important arbiters and authorities in the Sunni Muslim world, declared a worldwide jihad in defense of Arab Palestine. In the course of the war, the ulama of Al-Azhar periodically renewed the fatwa and call for jihad. The liberation of Palestine is a religious duty for all Muslims without exception, great and small. The Islamic and Arab governments should without delay take effective and radical measures, military or otherwise, pronounced the ulama at the end of April 48. On the day of the invasion of the Egyptian army, 15 May, Muhammad Mamun Shinawi, the rector of Al-Azhar, declared, "The hour of jihad is struck. 100 of you will defeat 1,000 of the infidels. This is the hour in which Allah promised paradise." And in December 48, on the eve of the final bout of hostilities between the Israel Defense Forces and the Egyptian army in the Negev and Sinai, the ulama of Al-Azhar renewed their call for jihad and cautioned the Arab kings. This was directed at Abdullah, king of Jordan, who was suspected of colluding with the Jews, against deviating from the way of the believers, otherwise they faced damnation. The jihadism of 48 was accompanied by a strong dose of anti-Semitism. In 1947, well before the outbreak of the war, the ulama of Al-Azhar issued a fatwa prohibiting all commercial contact with the Jews and defined anyone doing so as a sinner and criminal who will be regarded as an apostate to Islam. Samir Rifai, the Prime Minister of Transjordan, told visitors in Amman that year, 47, that the Jews are a people to be feared. Give them another 25 years and they will be all over the Middle East. In our country and Syria and Lebanon, in Iraq and Egypt, they were responsible for starting the 2 world wars. Yes, I have read and studied and I know they were behind Hitler at the beginning of his movement. Rifai's observations reflected beliefs that spread throughout the Middle East at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, which added a modern stratum to the classic anti-Semitic utterances embedded in the Quran, where the Jews are designated inter alia as a base people and as murderers of the prophets. There is religious hostility between the Muslims and the Jews from the beginning of Islam, which arose from the treacherous conduct of the Jews towards Islam and Muslims. And their prophet, King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, explained to President Roosevelt in 1943. The Muslim Brotherhood defined it thus: Jews are the historic enemies of Muslims and carry the greatest hatred for the nation of Muhammad. In April 48, Sheikh Muhammad Makhawif, the Mufti of Egypt, issued a fatwa calling on all Muslims to participate in the Jihad in Palestine. His contention was that the Jews intend to take over all the lands of Islam. It is no wonder then that during the 30s and 40s, before the war, the following hadith in different variants was quoted in Islamic tracts. The day of resurrection does not come until Muslims fight against Jews, until the Jews hide behind trees and stones, and until the trees and stones shout out, "O Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." Side by side with the traditional anti-Semitic message, the 1948 call to jihad had another historical pedigree. Before and during 48, the Zionists were often compared by Arab spokesmen to the Crusaders, and almost always it was said that their end would be similar. As the Secretary General of the Arab League, Abdul Rahman Azam Pasha, put it in 1947, "You, the Jews, are a temporary phenomenon. Centuries ago, the Crusaders established themselves in our midst against our will, and in 200 years we ejected them." Shukri al-Kawatli, the president of Syria, said similar things the following year, during the war itself, on the eve of the pan-Arab invasion. Overcoming the Crusaders took a long time, but the result was victory. There is no doubt that history is repeating itself. Riyad al-Sulh, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, told a British diplomat in the course of the war that it had taken the Arabs over a century to expel the Crusaders, but they had succeeded in the end. Zafar Dajani, the head of the Jaffa Chamber of Commerce, a Palestinian Arab, said similar things to a Jewish interlocutor in 47. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood announced that the death of martyrs in Palestine conjured up the memories of the Battle of Badr, one of the battles in the 7th century, as well as the early Islamic jihad for spreading Islam and Saladin's liberation of Palestine from the Crusaders. Perhaps it is worth noting that the first Arab to publicly make the comparison was Shukri al-Asali, the Ottoman governor of Nazareth during 1910-1911, which saw the struggle over the lands of Fula, an Arab village in the Jezreel Valley built around the ruins of a Crusader castle. The land had been bought by Zionist institutions, and shortly after, Kibbutz Merchavia was established on the site. Since then, Arab spokesmen have often referred to the Zionists as the new Crusaders. In 1947, Azam argued that the clash between the Arabs and Zionism might even trigger a new war between the Christian and Muslim worlds, as did the Crusades. The banner of jihad was raised aloft, or at least mentioned, with regard to the Yishuv already during the decades before 48. In March 36, the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament, Saeed al-Hajj Tabit, while on a visit to Palestine, called for jihad against the Zionists. A decade earlier, Hajj Muhammad Saeed al-Husseini, the Mufti of Gaza, issued a fatwa against land sales to Jews, arguing that as a result of Zionism, the Jews had lost their status as dhimmi, or wards of Islam, and any Muslim or Christian who helped them would be regarded as an apostate or infidel. In 1935, the first ulama, or gathering of Muslim religious scholars in Palestine, issued a similar fatwa. During the Palestine Arab Revolt of 36-39, the discourse among the rebels, to judge by their publications, was often religious as well as political nationalist, and the struggle was seen, at least in part, as religious. Indeed, the 1936 announcement of the establishment of the Arab Higher Committee, the leadership body of the national movement that in effect orchestrated the revolt, included the following typical sentence: Because of the general feeling of danger that envelops this noble nation, the Palestinian Arab nation, there is need for solidarity and unity and a focus on strengthening the holy national jihad movement. Preachers in the Nablus area were prominent among those mobilizing the population for combat during the revolt. Therefore, it was no surprise that when the Arab peoples launched their assault on the Yishuv in 1948, the campaign was regarded by many as a jihad and was reinforced with fatwas by the religious leaders embracing holy war. And it was to be expected that the Arab leaders would fall into step. Both King Farouk of Egypt and his foreign minister, Ahmad Khashaba, said during the summer of 48 that for the whole Arab world the struggle was a matter of religion. It was for them a matter of Jewish religion against their own religion. According to Farouk, the Arab masses were gripped by widespread religious fervor, and men were keen to enter the fray as the shortest road to heaven. Even Abdallah, king of Jordan, the most clear-headed and pragmatic of the Arab leaders, adopted the language of holy war when on 14 May he addressed his troops about to cross the Jordan River into Palestine. He who will be killed will be a martyr. He who lives will be glad of fighting for Palestine. I remind you of the jihad and of the martyrdom of your great-grandfathers. The defeat of the Arab armies failed to reduce the fervor of their spiritual guides. In December 48, the ulama of Al-Azhar renewed their call for jihad, addressing the Arab kings and presidents and opinion makers. They reiterated the need to free Palestine from the Jewish gangs, proclaiming that the Arab armies had fought victoriously in the conviction that they were fulfilling a sacred duty, and those who failed to undertake jihad would be damned. Let me conclude by saying that all I am doing here is suggesting a lead. I have not thoroughly and fully studied and searched the records, and what I am suggesting is not the fruit of systematic, thorough research. But perhaps what I have found will prompt others to look more thoroughly at the jihadi face of 1948. The Arab archives may be closed, but for a start, one might begin a thorough trawl through the Arab press, from Morocco to Egypt and Yemen. Such a trawl will help substantiate what I am suggesting here, or not. In any event, it will be worth the effort. If anybody would like to ask anything about this or related historical or political subjects, please, yes.
So, it would seem to me that most of the issue at the time of the 48 war was secular in nature. But did you come across any parallel language of like Nochem Hashem's or some sort of religious language on the Jewish side?
I have to admit I've never looked for it, and I've never encountered it. It's probably worth looking at the newspaper of the religious, or the newspapers of the religious, I suppose you could call it right, in Israel, or prior to Israel's founding, at the end of 47, beginning of 48, or through 48. It's probably worth looking at, but I would say this, that the religious parties and the religious element of the population in Palestine, the religious Jewish element, was very small and really insignificant, especially when you think of the Jewish community in Palestine today and its political structure and so on, demographics. At the time, the Haredim were something like 3% of the Jewish population. They've grown to over 10%, depends how you count. You include Shas, you don't include Shas. And national religious also were, at the time, also a very small minority. So there's no, what you're suggesting in a sense is you've got the two sides talking about jihad, one in Hebrew, one in Arabic. It's not so. On the Arab side, there's definitely a lot of this discourse in the speeches of not just religious leaders, but political leaders, as I've tried to point out. On the Jewish side, you certainly don't hear it from anything in the mainstream of the Yishuv. As I say, maybe it's worth looking at, but it'll still remain insignificant if it comes from the religious right as it existed in 47, 48. Yes.
Did any significant number of volunteers fight on the Arab side from non-Arab Muslim countries like Pakistan or Indonesia? Did any respond to this call for worldwide jihad?
Okay, the subject hasn't been thoroughly studied, but one can tell from the literature as it exists and from the documentation of the time that there was a fairly significant contingent of Bosnian Muslims in the fighting, helping the Palestinian Arabs, and in some way also assisting the Arab armies after they crossed the border. We're talking about hundreds, not more than that. From distant non-Arab countries other than Bosnia, I can't recall any other contingents. There were contingents from Morocco fighting alongside the Syrian army, and there were contingents, of course, of Egyptian Muslim brothers in southern Palestine during the first half of the war before the Egyptian army invaded. But I think, to answer precisely your question, we're talking, as far as I remember, only of Bosnians. I think, though, if we're talking about Pakistan, let me add one other thing. Pakistan and India at the time were actually quite involved in their own little struggles, which ended with millions of people dead and millions others forced from their homes. So I should imagine Pakistanis interested in jihad had their hands full where they were. Yes? And the question was about whether 48, 49, or maybe it's an assertion, what happened in 48, 49 is, or 47, 49 is important to the current situation. And the question, I think, was whether the study of it in some way helps us to reach... No, sorry.
Sorry, my actual question was, why is it fruitful to frame it as a jihad?
Okay, no, it's not...
Instead of a conflict about land and autonomy, and what the thinking of 48 as a religious war between Judaism and Islam brings us closer to...
Okay. The question, sorry, I misunderstood it. The question is, why is it helpful to frame the 47, 48, 49 conflict as religious rather than nationalist if we are looking towards some form of solution? Is that what you're saying? Yes. Well, I would say it's not a question of whether it's useful. Historians don't write things in terms of their utility. I think that might be political scientists, I'm not sure. But historians write in order to illuminate the past. And if there was jihadism in the motivation of Arab soldiers, to some extent at least, and Arab politicians, to some extent at least, in launching and fighting that war, you study it and you put it on the table, whether or not it's useful or otherwise for current political discourse or solving the problem. I'm not interested in utility, I'm interested in the truth. It's a different subject. Yeah.
No, but I want to follow up on that question. I think as a historian, the task of a historian is to present the whole truth. And I think the way you are presenting is a partial and perhaps a distorted understanding of what actually happened in 1948. I mean, one has to see it in the context of what was happening in Israel, with so many of the Arab Palestinians being evicted, being massacred, being thrown out. And I think if we miss out that dimension and just stress it as a jihad, we are really not fulfilling our role as historians of looking at the whole picture. And if we just stress the jihad aspect, then I'm afraid it's that we as historians, we can't escape the repercussions of our work on current situation.
Okay.
And I think,
I've got that. I'm always interested in advice. But actually, I wrote several books on the subject you just mentioned, what happened to the Palestinians, their eviction, massacres, and so on. And the book on 48, which I recently published, it covers those subjects, or those aspects of the 48 war as well, quite prominently, in fact. But what I'm saying here, this is a lecture not about the whole of the 48 war in its various aspects. It focuses on one aspect of the 48 war which has been ignored by historians in the past, and I think it's worth illumination and maybe even emphasis. Without doubt, the war had other aspects, as I said, and I've covered them. And if you want to ask any specific question about what happened and why Palestinians left or were evicted, what massacres occurred, etc., I'm certainly willing to answer it. Sure.
It does seem as if your presentation of these statements by different leaders of Arab nations at the time is not being contextualized, however. In other words, you are not describing the specific occasion upon which they said these things, what the statements are in response to, etc., who they are speaking, whether they're speaking on the radio, whether they're speaking on an address. So in this case, I think it is very necessary to provide this information.
Okay, no, it's a different type of information, but I can certainly contextualize. The context of the things I talked about, which happened in the statements made by Arab leaders, Arab religious leaders, and so on, in the course of the 47-48 war, was the war itself. That's the context. The beginning of the context, let me elaborate. Maybe this will satisfy you more. The beginning of the context was the United Nations partition resolution of the 29th of November 47, which suggested that the solution to the Palestine problem should be one of partitioning the land into Jewish and Arab states. The Jews, the mainstream of the Jewish community, its leadership accepted this resolution. The Palestinian Arabs and their brother Arab leaders in the Arab countries neighboring Palestine rejected that resolution. They rejected the will of the international community and then went to war in 2 stages against the Jewish community in Palestine and against the Yishuv. Some of the statements I read, those relating to the ulama of Al-Azhar of the 2nd of December, is a direct reference to, that's the context, a direct response to the United Nations partition resolution of the 29th of November and to the beginning of the fighting. And the idea that the Jewish state should be established in Palestine. The statements I read relating to April from the Mufti of Egypt and the ulama of Al-Azhar again from April 48 relate to the impending invasion on the 15th of May of the Arab armies, including Egypt's army, and that's what actually happened. It in fact gave them the sanction, provided them with the religious sanction for the assault on Israel. That's what it's about. That's the context. You may not like the context, you may have a problem with the context, but that's the context.
I don't have any problem with the context, I just believe that the context should be mentioned when you state.
Well, I did try to suggest that the invasion was on the 15th of May, the statements were April, many of the listeners here might have actually connected the events, but I think those are the contexts. The 2 stages of the UN resolution and the 2 stages of assault on the issue. Yeah.
I want to ask you if we ended the war at 1948. Did we also ended the jihadi concept that maybe didn't appear in the other more future conflicts between Israel and the Arabic countries?
Okay. The question was whether the calls for jihad and the jihadi context was repeated in Israel's later wars. And the simple answer, if you're asking me, is that I don't know. I haven't researched that, so I won't answer it. I don't know. And maybe some work has to be done about that. I just don't know.
So the concept of jihad, as far as you know, didn't ended up at 1948?
I don't know. I haven't studied the material. I don't want to answer anything which I haven't studied. I don't know. But I dealt just with the 48 war, and by the way, through looking at the documentation, came upon this jihadi frame of reference as well. Yeah.
Thank you for speaking, Professor Morris. I had a question about context and the word jihad. And jihad's a pretty complicated term and concept, and it's changed a lot, especially since the 1970s. And I was wondering about any potential conflict between what jihad might have meant to a an Arab audience in the 40s and what jihad means to an English-speaking audience now?
Okay, I'm not too sure. Somebody, the question was about whether jihad in 48, as used by Arabs at the time, is the same as what we understand jihad to mean today, or what Arabs use it as to mean today. I think the use of the word jihad, the concept of jihad, as used in these statements I've just read regarding 47, 48, was consensual among Arabs, and they understood it to mean another holy war, as I said, in a succession of bouts of holy war against the infidel, this time in Palestine. That's how they understood it. It wasn't about reforming oneself or reforming Islam, as sometimes the word jihad or one of its variants is used today. But it was simply about warfare. We're talking about holy war. I'm not too sure that most Muslims and most Arabs today also don't use the word jihad in the same fashion. In other words, I think most of them understand when they talk about jihad, unlike some of their interpreters in the West, they know what they're talking about, and they're talking about what I am talking about here, holy war. It could be that there are some Muslims and Arabs who also use it in some more spiritual and internal way, but I don't think that's how it's commonly brandished in the Arab world even today.
If I could follow up.
Sure.
I think I agree with that. I just wonder about the implications of using a term like that for an audience that would immediately think of 9/11, suicide bombers, that sort of thing. I wonder. I don't know. I would just ask that. I would just ask you: are you addressing that in your work when you talk about this term? I've read
No, not in the word. I was speaking about jihad in 47, 49, and I don't address the future in that book. That is the later decades. I address just what happened in 48, 47, 49. It could be that in a future work I'll try to contextualize the use of the word jihad and the doctrine of jihad in 48 in a wider chronological framework, but I haven't done that yet. Yeah.
I'm curious whether you would call this a defensive jihad, or in your earlier characterization you said aggressive, offensive, defensive, offensive. In your work in 1948 that I've read, your earlier work, you described in detail how the Israeli army had an offensive idea in mind. And I'm sure that this was known to the Palestinians and Arabs then. So how would you characterize this use of jihad?
The question was whether the jihad of the jihadi initiative and understanding of jihad in 47, 48 was defensive or offensive in nature. Incidentally, traditional Islam interpretations of the Quran and the idea of jihad occasionally refer to this distinction between defensive and offensive, though usually the Islamic interpreters of the Quran, the mainstream, accepts the necessity of offensive jihad, of spreading Islam, not in defense against an infidel incursion or invasion, but in spreading Islam. God's will is that Islam be spread through warfare, also through proselytizing and other methods, but also through warfare, and that's the command of God. So it's in Islam, that's the accepted version of jihad, though there were people who tried to make, in the interpretations in the Middle Ages, some sort of distinction. In 48, and that's what you're asking about, without doubt, in Muslim Arab minds, the whole Zionist enterprise was aggression. In other words, from the moment the Jews, or the first Jews, stepped off the boats and were carried on Arab backs into the port of Jaffa, and that's how it worked. They got off the boats, which couldn't get into the port because it wasn't built for it. Skiffs came up to the boats, manned by Arabs. The Arabs took them on the skiffs to some point offshore and then carried them on their backs, as Ben Gurion describes his arrival in Palestine in 1906. He arrived on the back of an Arab stevedore, or whatever you call it. From the inception of Zionism and the inception of the nationalist, Palestinian Arab nationalist movement which came a bit later in the 1920s, the Arabs regarded the Zionist influx as an invasion and as aggression. And in this sense, their launching of war against the Jewish community in November, December 47, and in fact the Arab invasions of May 48 by the Arab states were defensive acts. But in terms of the brief history from 47 onwards, and in terms of the United Nations resolution, and in terms of the world community's desires, and what the Arabs did was aggression. They were aggressing against the will of the international community as embodied in that resolution. So it's problematic, but probably in the eyes of most of the Arabs proclaiming jihad, it was probably seen as part of the defense against the Zionists, and if you like, even in some wider framework, as defense against the incursion and influence of the West in the Islamic lands, which had begun centuries before, or certainly decades before, in its modern form. And Zionism was just seen as one more agent of the West trying to penetrate their lands and take over their lands. Yeah.
I have a quick question about the sources you were able to use. You mentioned at the beginning of your speech what kind of sources you weren't able to use, and I was sort of curious where you were drawing the quotes and references that you mentioned from, and specifically to what extent the sources you were using were meant for public or for a public audience, such as a speech or a newspaper, and to what extent they might even
Okay.
use or correspondence.
Okay, the question was about the sources of these quotes and references to jihad by Arab leaders and so on. And you'll readily find them, incidentally. Most of the quotes are from my book, 1948, The First Arab-Israeli War. So the footnotes contain where they're from, but I'll say tell you what they are. Most of the references are from British documentation. In other words, British ambassadors and consuls and whatever who meet with Arab leaders who tell them things, or they hear it in the capitals, in the Arab capitals, and say Farouk said this or Farouk said that. But usually it's one-to-one meetings, all of which are secret. They're not for common widespread consumption. They're secret documents and closed private talks, not public talks. This is true about the Arab leaders when they talk to these diplomats. When the ulama of Al-Azhar or the Mufti of Egypt and so on declare jihad, as they do in December 47, April 48 and so on, these are usually public statements, public declarations, which do also appear in Arab newspapers at the time, but are also usually reported by the diplomats in those capitals in their reports back to London or Washington or wherever. Apart from now a general word about the documentation of the 48 book in general, most of it is based on Israeli, British, American, and UN documentation. In the absence, as you rightly point out, of Arab state papers, or absence in the sense of unavailability because Arab archives are closed. They may contain things, they may not, we don't know what they have, because it's never been opened, not to Israelis, not to Arab scholars, not to American scholars, etc. One must use Israeli intelligence documentation, Western intelligence documentation, Western diplomatic documentation from the various posts in the Middle East to penetrate the Arab side and to hear what Arab leaders are saying. It's true that Arab leaders might, in this documentation, say one thing to a British diplomat and not quite the same thing to fellow Arabs, say, in a meeting of the Arab heads of state or foreign ministers, and there's a problem. But on this particular subject, jihad, I doubt if they are saying two different things. In other words, if they're talking to British diplomats and saying, yes, we've launched a jihad, or we must launch a jihad because this is what the street wants, they're not going to be lying. They'll, if anything, moderate what the street is saying rather than make it more extreme. Yeah. Proof of what? I
But
don't...
you see, because if we talk about context, we need to have contradicting context. But what we see in the history, maybe I'm not an historian, but what we see is that we have all the time, over and over again, we have the same context in different times of the history. So my question is, if you know of any specific context that can contradict our belief as Jews that we are just persecuted by radical Islam.
I'm not...
If we talk in context, we need to have different contexts and then we can compare one context to another. But if we have only one context all the time, then what do we have to talk about? So do we have any, I don't know, maybe in the history you have like one politician who used the term jihad and he didn't mean to kill the Jews? I'm interested to know.
I'm not completely sure what the question is. Insofar as I understand what you're saying, jihad isn't something only to do with Jews. It's to do with all non-believers, Buddhists, Hindu, Christians, and so on. Atheists as well, and among many jihadis, also other types of Muslims. I mean, there's enough, bombs thrown into funeral processions by Shiites against Sunnis and Sunnis against Shiites in Iraq to show you that they also use the word jihad quite often. So it's not only directed against Jews, but the context, the thing I was talking about is the specific jihad in Palestine. I did try to show that it's maybe part of a wider conceptual framework which keeps recurring in Islam. Yeah. Whichever.
So it's sort of two questions, but really one. So you mentioned the Bosnians fighting. So I was just wondering if they're linked to the SS unit. I know there was in Bosnia 43, sorry. So I don't know. They're sort of coming from there, they're connected somehow. I don't know. And my other question is sort of connected. How is this? Is there anything modern about this jihad in 48? Is it influenced by what just happened in Europe? Ideas coming from there, from either Nazi side or even like left-wing terrorism? Because I feel there's these two big ideologies in Europe, and how did they influence what was going on in the East?
Okay, it's two different questions. About the Bosnians, I have a feeling, this is really off the top of my head and I shouldn't speak this way, but I have a feeling that, the question is about Bosnians who fought in Palestine. Were they veterans of the European engagements in which Bosnians often showed up on the Eastern Front in the German army against the Russians? My feeling is that not that many Bosnians who fought against the Russians probably survived. And even if some of them survived, they probably weren't that eager to get to Palestine for another bout of war against the infidel. That's just a feeling. I'm not, I've never checked the numbers or anything. And it's probably very impossible to actually, you need to work it out name by name. What I would say is this, that Haj Amin al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, the head of the Arab Higher Committee, worked in Berlin in the 1940s, from 41 until 1945, was an employee of the German Foreign Ministry, broadcast to the Middle East messages of anti-British jihad, and raised Bosnian Muslim troops for the Wehrmacht to fight on the Eastern Front. An interesting thing about 48 is, and Husseini was also a cleric, they're not really empowered to issue a fatwa. Husseini never actually called for jihad, as far as I know, as far as the evidence I've seen. He never actually called for a jihad against the Jews. I talked about the priests of Egypt and the theologians of Egypt, but I've never seen a quote of Husseini calling for jihad in the battle for Palestine in 48. I've never seen that. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't, I haven't seen it. The question also was whether there's a connection between the jihadism against Jews in the 48 war and the Holocaust, or the Nazi war against the Jews in Europe. And is there some sort of doctrinal connection between the two? Husseini probably, most certainly knew about the Holocaust, most certainly favored it. He wanted to kill Jews, he was an anti-Semite, and he certainly wanted to kill Jews in Palestine. But whether he needed to make such a connection, I don't know, and I don't think, because jihad was a deeply Islamic concept. Fighting the Jews was something that Muhammad had been doing in the 7th century when Islam arose. He slaughtered the Jewish tribes of Hijaz. So it begins there, and he doesn't really need the stamp of Holocaust or European anti-Semitism to add when he wants to go to war against the Jews. And as I say, though he may not have called it jihad, he definitely would have been happy to extinguish Jewish life in Palestine. Yeah.
1948 was the end of World War II. I feel like if you want to really look at the origins of 20th century jihadism, it would be good to look at the end of World War I and the end of the Caliphate and the experience of Sayyid Qutb in Egypt and the Muslim Ikhwan. I think that there, it's only in the context of those that you're going to really be able to integrate jihadism into the 1948 years.
Okay, look, I said before that the jihad against Palestine was understood by many Muslims as only part of a wider jihad or wider push against the West in general and its influences.
Talk about the rise of jihadism in the 20th century.
Well, you're right. It's been a consistent and growing...
The grievances of the Arab community.
Yes, the grievances of the Arab world against the West and its penetration and corruption of the Muslim world begins before World War I. It finds in some way some expression in World War I, if you like, in Turkey's proclamation of jihad against Britain in the course of World War I, though the British also called for jihad against Turkey when they raised the Arab revolt of 1916. It was used, the word jihad was used by both sides in World War I. World War I wasn't in general an assault on the West by the Muslims. This was only a very small part of it in Turkish minds. So it's not really the context. The context precedes World War I, when there were various people who preached against, like the initiators of Arab nationalism in its early years, before there were actual Arab national movements, did speak, Rida and others, about expelling the West and about the evil influences of the West. World War I in some ways was a gap or a interregnum in the Arab efforts to push the West out. Because the West was so important and so strong in the Arab world, the British, the French, and the invasions and conquests of Arab lands, there was a sort of an interregnum in this. But after World War I, it arises again with revolts in Iraq and semi-revolts in Egypt and Syria and so on. The word jihad is again invoked in the efforts against the West. You're right that there is some connection, but it's low-key at the time and much less obvious than when jets fly into the Twin Towers.
In the context of this, the Zionism becomes a kind of scapegoat.
It's not a scapegoat. It's seen as one arm, a branch of the West's assault on the Muslim Arab world. That's how it's seen. Yeah.
Two questions. First of all, you read us quite a few statements made by Arab leaders who suggest they're feeling very anti-Semitic at the time. But these were statements by dictators who do not represent their people, at least in a democratic fashion. Yet it seems that you attribute the anti-Semitism to the people as a whole. Maybe could you, that was my understanding, if I'm wrong, please correct me, but maybe could you share for us some of your techniques as a historian of how you understand the mentality of the people as a whole, when you only have the statements of a few. And the second question is, you mentioned that there was at this time a great mixing of political and religious language by the same people. Do you think that in the early days of this conflict, before the 48 war, do you think that it started primarily as a political conflict and that religious language was put on top of it to describe it, or was it
in non-democratic societies, it's difficult to actually know what the people think. And the people may think different things also. What we do know is that Islam, as embodied in the Quran and some of the hadiths, has anti-Semitic elements. There are in fact also philo-Semitic elements in the sense that the Muslims, Islam sees itself as a son of the other monotheistic religions, an heir to, a better heir, a successor, a superior successor, but there is also the anti-Semitic element in the Quran. The Jews are called the base people, sons of pigs and apes and so on. And the Muslims at origin treated the Jews very nastily, if we are to believe the Quran. And the Quran, of course, is a book which comes from the Islamic side, not the Jewish side of what went on. They slaughtered the Jewish tribes, essentially, or forced them into conversion. Later, the caliphs and the Islamic world often accepted Jews as second-class citizens in their midst as minorities, but always essentially discriminated against Jews, and there were occasional bouts of explicit violence, pogroms, large pogroms, forcible conversions at sword's point, and so on. So there's this tradition. This tradition, part of the Islamic tradition, which is, as I say, anti-Semitic, is inculcated and is absorbed by the Arab masses, who happen to be largely religious, unlike the masses, say, in the modern Western world. They are religious. 95% of Arabs today, Muslim Arabs, are religious. They believe God exists, that He wants and directs the people and the political leadership to do this or that, and so on and so forth. It doesn't mean that all of them are what we call Islamists, but they are believers. It's not clear how important this anti-Semitism is in the assault on the Jews of Palestine, the Jewish community, and later the Jewish state. It probably plays a part, but it's not clear that it's necessarily only or primarily a religious assault, but that is one of the elements of the assault, and that's the element I've just tried to point out. One could perhaps divide between today, one could perhaps divide between Fatah, PLO attitudes towards the Jews and the Jewish state, and the Hamas attitudes towards the Jewish state. And you could say that the PLO and the Fatah have waged over the past 40 years or whatever a political battle against Jews, albeit to get all of Palestine for themselves, or even only part of Palestine for themselves alongside the Jews, but it's been politically motivated, while the Hamas, or the religious fundamentalists, are waging essentially a jihad, a holy war against the Jews, and for them the politics is the religion. There's no distinction at all between the two. The problem with this is, as I said, that all the Fatah members also, and the PLO members also, from top to bottom, are religious. You only have to see Arafat, the head of the PLO, the founder of the Fatah, praying in a mosque 5 times a day or whatever it was, to understand that the man knows the various prayers and takes them seriously. You have to look at suicide bombing in Israel in the course of the Second Intifada. And there were a large number of Hamas suicide bombers, and they began the suicide bombing, and then it's aped by the Fatah, who also begin to send out suicide bombers. But several suicide bombers were actually captured. There's an oxymoron here. They were unsuccessful. They were captured because they couldn't turn on their belts or whatever it was. And when they were interrogated, the Fatah suicide bombers, they also said they intended to reach heaven and get hold of 71 virgins, or whatever the correct number is. In other words, they were also impelled and motivated by religious motivation, even though they purportedly belonged to a secular movement. So in the minds, what I'm saying is, in the minds of so-called secular Arabs, also, perhaps this is also a religious conflict. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
What do you think your reappraisal of the world, the reappraisal that you're planning out to
I can't hear. Anyway.
What do you think that your reappraisal of the role of religious discourse in 1948 perhaps has to tell us about the emergence of specifically Palestinian Arab identities and their sense of their relationship to the rest of the Arab and
I don't know. Look, I've never reappraised the subject because I never encountered the subject or thought about it. Maybe I did encounter it, but like most historians, didn't pay note. And then later, recently, began to see there's a subject here. So there's no reappraisal, it's an initial appraisal. Now, what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Can you tell us anything about how Palestinians saw themselves in relation to the rest of the Arab world? Because we're essentially what I understand you discussing here is the delicate interconnectedness and interrelation between a nationalistic worldview, a nationalistic or political organization and struggle, and one which is religious and pan-national. And within the Arab world, these are related, interrelated in very intricate ways that are quite difficult to disentangle. Clearly, one of the things that occurs to Palestinians in the course of between 1930 and the present is that these various identities are coalescing, taking shape and shifting, and some are, at certain points we see them as largely secular, now we're coming to see them as always having been more religious than we thought they were. So I'm just wondering if you think that this research that you're bringing to undertake can also begin to shed light on this sense of what it meant to be Palestinian, to be Palestinian nationalists in 1940.
It's very difficult to do this in societies, to study societies in this respect, which are largely illiterate, as the Palestinians were in 48, and they were more literate than the Arabs around. So it's even more difficult in relation to Syrian Arabs or Egyptian Arabs at the time. And I think with the amount of documentation which is available, partly as a result of this illiteracy, but also because the Palestinians didn't really produce state papers and didn't produce real documentation, it's impossible to work out. In other words, it's impossible to work out, to try to distinguish between the various strands in their thinking at the time. What I would say is this, that I think the element of religion and the importance of religion in their national struggle undergoes fluctuation from 1920 onwards down to our day. And there rises and falls in the amount or the quantity of religious input in their nationalism over these 80 or 90 years. Where you can see that in 1929, religion is dominant in their identity and in their politics in relation to what happens in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, and so on, and there's riots as a result. The same applies in the 30s, 36, 39, and the same in some way, according to what I discovered, applies to 47, 48. It could be that at other times, in the early 1940s, in the early 1920s, mid-1920s, the religious element plays a much lesser role among those who are politically active, and we're talking about a very small minority of the Palestinians to begin with. It's usually just the literate or some of the literate upper class, middle class, which is involved in this. The moment it spills out from simple talk and publication in newspapers and speeches to the streets and to rioting, it's there that you start finding the lower classes also represented in the activism, in the national movement. And at that point, it becomes more religious. Well, what one can also say is that religion and religious discourse is used by the political leadership to mobilize the lower classes to action, because simple politics and talking about a nation state and so on isn't going to get the peasants and the slum dwellers in the towns to actually go out into the streets and kill Jews. But if you start invoking Jewish threats to the Temple Mount and the mosques on the Temple Mount and so on, then you can actually rope in some peasants and slum dwellers to come and riot. So religion also plays this role of mobilization because it touches the chords, it touches the hearts of what can move these masses. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered what you're saying, but asking, but that's the best I can do. Yeah.
So I'm just curious about Christians. So Christians obviously constitute an important minority among the Arab population in this part of the world, and that's probably even more true in 1948 than it is today. Certainly that's true for Lebanon. So I'm just curious if you see any attempt by political actors in Cairo or Damascus or wherever, maybe trying to temper or shy away from the language of jihad in order to sort of preserve a kind of sectarian unity or something like that?
Okay, I'll say to begin with that I haven't studied it properly. I haven't studied the extent, as I say, it still needs to be studied, the depth and so on of jihadism in the various Arab societies with respect to the 48 war and the problem of Palestine. One of the reasons that Husseini, in the 1930s, during the Arab Revolt, and perhaps this is true about 48, resisted the language of jihad, and as I say, he never actually issued the call to jihad, as far as I've been able to make out, is because he was mindful of how this might affect Christians among the Palestinians. The Christians at the time represented something like 8–9% of the Palestinian population and were prominent in commerce, education, and in the middle class. They had a much greater representation in the Palestinian middle class. Some of them also were very politically active, people like George Habash later on, and Wadi Haddad and so on, in a way to demonstrate that though they were Christians, they were even more religious than the Pope, yes, more nationalistic than, because usually in the 20s, 30s and 40s, Christians were suspect in the eyes of the Muslim majority, who were the leadership also of the national movement, was suspect of being either pro-British or even in some way complicit with the Zionists against the Muslims and against Muslim Palestinian nationalism. So there may have been some care taken by the mainly Muslim leadership of the Palestinian national movement not to alienate Christians and therefore to be reserved about the use of the term jihad. I don't know to what extent this is true in Egypt and Syria, where there were Christian minorities. In Egypt it's large, in Syria by then it was very, very small. But as we see, the leadership of Egypt, and especially the religious Muslim leadership of Egypt, were not reserved, and they issued these calls for jihad publicly, perhaps assuming that the Christians would remain silent and quiescent and would remain loyal to the Egyptian state and to the Arab purpose. The one other thing, the proportion of Christians among the Palestinians has steadily declined, among Palestinians in the Holy Land, abroad as well, because their birth rates were much smaller than Muslim birth rates. So the Christian element today in Palestinian discourses is completely insignificant. Today in Palestine, I think it's something like 2 to 3% are actually Christian of the Arabs. It's declined from something closer to 10%. And are not really significant, and you don't find Christians anywhere in political leadership of the Palestinian national movement today. I mean, I can't think of a name of anyone who's actually Christian. Maybe you can, I can't. Yeah.
Certainly most Israeli states don't think of this as a religious war, as perhaps some Arab states in the next 4 years. And I think we see, possibly as a result, that Israel has given a great deal of political concessions, given back lots of language at different times for peace, given a lot of concessions. Are there any religious concessions that can be given other than abandoning Judaism? Is there anything that can appeal to the religious, the sentiments of some Arabs, perhaps? This is a religious conflict rather than a political?
Well, as I said, it's many Arabs do regard it as a religious conflict. Hamas certainly regards it, and they are the most popular political party in the Palestinian national movement today. and they regard it as a religious conflict, and there's no concession which can be made except the immolation of Israel. In other words, Israel must go away. The Jews basically must leave the land to complete Arab sovereignty. That's, I think, the only concession which can be made from their point of view. Okay, sorry.
Sort of a multi-part question, some of which has been asked implicitly already by many people. It has to do with your technique of comparison, so to speak. You said earlier your concern is not with utility, it's with the truth. But the frame that you put on the truth, the frame that you put on the evidence, what context you use and what sources outside of a specific event, 1948, and the discussion or the use of the term jihad, has a lot to do with how we understand that event, what sort of aspects of how we might explain that event are unveiled. And in the paper that you gave today,
He's a masochist taking questions, isn't he?
A wide swath of historical sources besides 1948, 7th and 8th centuries, the Middle Ages, between the 15th and the 17th centuries. Somebody in the audience suggested you might have looked at World War I profitably. You might have looked at the influences at the time from Europe. All these indicate a certain framing that has contributed to what we call a characterization of the mindset of jihad. But you might have done it differently. For instance, why is it necessarily more illuminating to look at these particular historical examples that were not contemporary?
Okay.
For example, I think you get the gist of the question.
Yeah, I can answer that if you have.
One other thing, the comparison, just to give an analogy, if you had used those sorts of historical comparisons with, say, Christianity, as an attempt to understand a comment made, or a series of comments made that a certain war was just, invoking the idea of a Christian just war, and then look back at what just war meant and the sort of things that Christianity had done and the violent sort of world-conquering orientation, you'd get a particular view of Christianity and just war that might not be so accurate.
Okay, no, what I was really doing, I don't think I was even doing it myself. What I was really doing was quoting, or trying to quote and frame what happened in 48 through the quotes of those proclaiming and talking about jihad in 48. They were doing the comparison and contextualization. They were saying they were heirs to the Arabs, the Muslims who had assailed the Crusader states, and they were the heirs to Muhammad's conquest of Hijaz and the Arab breakout from the Arabian Peninsula into North Africa, Southern Europe, and so on. It's true that I did talk, when I tried to give jihad some context, I did talk about the 4 stages, as I see it, of jihadism in Christian Muslim relations since the rise of Islam. But really these things were discussed and cited in the jihadi propaganda and declarations of 1948. It wasn't me doing it so much as them referring to them, I think. And I think that that was their mindset, that's the way they saw it, that they were the heirs to these great conquerors. And I think we should treat them with respect and accept it. That's how they saw things.
So one last question and then wrap up.
I would like to come back to the point of the lecture. To me, is 48 as jihad. What I think very important and challenging is the point that today a lot of commentators or scholars like Gurion, Daniel Pipes, or Caroline Glick, they are saying, well, it has always been a thought to think about it is a kind of territorial, sociological conflict as Europeans has known conflict for a long time, especially after 1945 or even before. It was a thought of scholarly research in the last decades. And I think it's very, very important what you pointed out, that it was against time. That means at the very beginning of what is now called Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it wasn't really a conflict to entities of people, but it was a conflict of faith. That means it was the ideology of jihad on one side and typical Western democracy on the other. And this is an ongoing conflict, as we know, and it's not just related to Jews, but especially, but also to America and Western values in general. So I think your lecture was kind of the forefront of what is, as I mentioned, Mary Rubin, the other other people, they have been working on, or this report also, for decades on the topic of that the conflict is not a conflict we know in Europe. That is, for example, I myself, I'm a little bit scared about it, Mr. Mitchell, who was appointed from Obama not to go to the Middle East because he was so well doing in Northern Ireland. Well, this is a, so to say, stupid thing, because Northern Ireland was a typical European conflict, a political conflict. It was not a conflict of jihad against the West. And so to appoint a person like him to solve this really religious and important conflict, which will tremendously important for Israel, might be not the best answer. So I think you point out a very important point for total research on the next years, decades, or even longer.
So you want me to denounce Mitchell? No. Incidentally, I'm not sure that you're completely right about Ireland. The reason that the Irish conflict has gone on for the last 500 years, well, one of the reasons for its longevity is the religious element in the conflict, albeit not Muslim Christian, but Christian, Catholic versus Protestant. And that's one of the reasons for its depth and, as I say, for its longevity. You're right. I think the thing you're pointing to, and I think that's is right, is that Westerners have a difficulty, people in the West, Norwegians and Americans also, have a difficulty in understanding the conflict, in understanding the conflict with the Islamic world, or the tension with the Islamic world, as stemming from religious motivations, at least from the Islamic side, because the West doesn't see things in terms of religion. Even though Bush may have a constituency of fundamentalists and so on, that is not what drives American foreign policy or Israeli foreign policy. But it does drive a lot of what is going on in the Muslim world vis-a-vis the West. And Westerners have a problem because the mindsets are completely different. I don't know if that's what you were talking about, but that's...
Okay, so just to sum up, I just wanted to make two very quick announcements. First of all, on behalf of YIISA, I want to thank Lauren Clark for putting this whole day together. And for those of you who are not on our mailing list, tomorrow afternoon at noon at ISPS, we're having Mordechai Kedar, who's from Bar Ilan University. He's speaking about Islamicism and the social construction of the other. That's at noon. And on Thursday at 4:15, Jeffrey Herf will be speaking about perceptions of Nazi propaganda in the Arab Middle East. And so, on behalf of YIISA, I want to thank Professor Benny Morris very much for coming here this evening, and also to thank William Prusoff for being here as well this evening. So, and thank you.
In 1948 is Jihad. Midway in the First Israeli-Arab War, in August 48, Emil Ruri, a member of the Arab Higher Committee, the cabinet of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, blamed the Arab states for creating the Palestinian refugee problem. He argued that the Arab states had pushed and cajoled the Arabs of Palestine into launching hostilities against the Jewish community in Palestine, then known as the Yishuv, in defiance of the United Nations partition resolution, while the Palestinians were disorganized and unprepared for war, and they themselves, the Arab states, had launched their invasion of Israel in May 48, while disunited and insufficiently prepared. The war had resulted in the creation of the refugee problem. He rejected a solution of the problem by way of repatriation, arguing that the Jews would then hold them hostage, the refugees, and torture them severely. Ruri assumed that a refugee return would be achieved through negotiations with Israel, and an agreement so achieved would mark the beginning of Arab acquiescence in Israel's existence. We must inculcate in the heart of every Arab, he said, hatred for the Jews, and we must renew the jihad against Israel. The refugees, he concluded, would return to their places only after Palestine was reconquered. Months earlier, in January 48, just after the start of hostilities, Mati el-Murannam, head of the Arab Women's Organization, the female arm of the Arab Higher Committee, told an interviewer, the UN partition decision of 47 has united all Arabs.
Interdisciplinary study of anti-Semitism, and tonight is the second annual Professor William Prusoff Honorary Lecture. And last year, the professor that lectured for the Bill Prusoff Honorary Lecture was Alan Dershowitz, and this year it's Benny Morris. And Professor Prusoff, who's here with us, is a professor of pharmacology, and he was one of the first individuals who supported the whole idea, or the whole notion of creating the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism. And I was introduced to him by Dr. Alon Kanan, who's here as part of the medical school at Yale University. And I remember going with Alon to meet Professor Prusoff to discuss the idea of creating ISGAP, and then hopefully bringing ISGAP, or the Institute to the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, to Yale. And Bill was one of the first people to believe in the notion, or the idea, before it was really even created into something real. So we have a small plaque for Professor Prusoff in honor of today's lecture and his contribution to creating YIISA. Without his support, it would have been impossible to do. And Professor Prusoff, for those who don't know, has been at Yale University for more than 5 decades now, and he was one of the driving forces, or the founders of medical research that led to the creation of a substance that, I'm not speaking the words of a pharmacologist or a chemist, but created medication to help combat HIV and AIDS. And he was the first, him and his research partner were the first people to create medicine to combat AIDS. So his accomplishments in his field have been incredible, and his work has directly helped to save the lives and prolong the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And his work combating anti-Semitism, another type of disease, has also been helpful. So it's really an honor, and if you don't mind standing, and I'll bring you the plaque. So thank you very much. And also, on this occasion, I'm going to present the plaque on behalf of YIISA and everybody who's a part of the Yale Initiative's interdisciplinary study on anti-Semitism, the researchers who are here and our colleagues, to Benny Morris on this occasion. And there's, I'll introduce you in your lecture in a second, but all of the work that you've done in the pursuit of truth in a very complicated and complex part of the world, and with its history and its current situation, has obviously been impressive. And your current work over the years, especially combating radical forms of hatred and the demonization of groups of people, your work has been very insightful and important, and there's nobody more appropriate for you than you. And most recently with Yale University Press, he wrote a book called 1948, A History of the First Arab-Israeli War. And he has an upcoming book, again with Yale University Press. It's entitled One State, Two States, Resolving the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. And I must also say that I had the privilege of being with Professor Morris in Vienna and Berlin recently, where there was conferences dealing with the issues of Iran and its incitement to genocide, and the potential of a nuclear energy program that the Iranian regime, the revolutionary regime, is pursuing, and the politics of hate of not only the Iranian regime but its non-state actors of Hamas and Hezbollah, and Professor Morris has been a leader in dealing with these issues and bringing about public awareness to them. And I just literally came back late from Israel, where I was a guest at the Iranian Center, the study of Iranians, the Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University, where I gave a lecture yesterday and was visiting with other scholars dealing with these issues. So the work of Professor Morris is timely and of extraordinary importance, so it's really an honor that you're here this evening. Professor Morris.
Well, I'm going to give a formal lecture. I want to be very accurate in what I'm talking about. Afterwards, I suppose there'll be time for questions and answers about historical subjects or political.
To be here for this special evening, so thank you very much. Okay, so very briefly, so tonight's lecture by Benny Morris is entitled 1948 as Jihad. And as many of you know, Professor Benny Morris is a professor of history at Gurion University in Sheva. He's currently, he's published groundbreaking work on the study of the Palestinian refugee problem, and is one of the most important historians on the Arab-Israeli conflict, and has contributed much, sort of part of the breakthrough, if you will, on some of the understanding of the history of the Middle East and the Palestinian and Israeli-Arab issues. He received a Bachelor of Arts in European History and European Philosophy, and he did a doctorate in Modern European Thought and History at Cambridge University. He's been a Senior Associate Member of St. Anthony's College in Oxford, a McCarthy Fellow at the Brookings Institute, a Fellow at the Truman Institute at Hebrew University. He was a visiting professor at the University of Maryland, and he's been a foreign correspondent for the Jerusalem Post and has written widely in academic publications, journals, as well as the media. He's the author of The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem from 1947 to 1949. He's the author of The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited, which was published in 2004. He wrote a book entitled 1948 and After, The Israelis and the Palestinians.